Hello and welcome all. Welcome to ELS Discourse. This is the sixth episode, and we are back after a very long break. Today we have with us Nisha Agrawal, who is an economist who has worked on poverty, inequality, and social development issues for more than 30 years. She was the first CEO of Oxfam India for 10 years from 2008 to 2018. During this period, she focused Oxfam's work on the most lagging states and most marginalized groups. Prior to that, she has worked with the World Bank for almost 20 years. She has extensive experience in working in East Asia region and East Africa region. She was also research associate at the Impact Research Centre at Melbourne University in Australia. Currently, she is an active member of civil society networks and organizations promoting social justice with a special interest in promoting gender equality. Today we have Nisha ma'am with us to discuss a book she has edited, which is Her Right to Equality. This is the sixth book in the Rethinking India series. And welcome, ma'am. Thank you so much for taking time out to talk to us.
Thank you so much.
So, India has been ranked 140th among 156 countries in the Global Gender Gap Index 2021, slipping 28 places from the last year. The primary reasons for the drop indicate disproportionate representation in politics, low women's labor force participation, low literacy, and income inequality. Her Right to Equality, from Promise to Power, the sixth book of Rethinking India series, is particularly dedicated to three of these themes, which include women's voice in households, economic sphere, and political representation. So beginning with the very first question. So what was the broad idea of this book? How did it came into being? We know of the series, the 14-volume series, which Penguin is coming up with Samruddha Bharat Foundation. The sixth book, this was launched on International Women's Day, I believe, 8th of March. So how did this book came into being? What was the idea behind it, and how did you go about the selection of authors? Because the list of authors and it's remarkable, and the essays are a delight to read.
Thank you so much. So in before the 2019 elections, actually, Samruddha Bharat organization was organizing a series of roundtables, and I'm an advisor to that organization, so I also help them organize on many different topics. And the idea was to bring together a wide range of group people, from politicians to academics, activists, civil society, and you see that variety reflected in the authorship of the book as well. And to get the best ideas on putting together, feeding ideas into the political process, and especially for all the opposition parties that were trying to put together a common minimum program. So it was a very exciting event, and we realized that people really wanted to speak, and there was very little interaction between citizens and politicians. That when people got a chance directly to speak to politicians, they were happy to come and share their ideas. So we got all these wonderful ideas free of any cost to us. People flew in from all over the country to share. And then we thought we shouldn't lose them. Even if whatever government wins, this is how countries make progress, is through ideas and looking at new ways of solving old problems. So we decided to come up with a series for these books. And I had then offered to edit the one on gender. And as you said, this is the sixth in a volume. We'll have about, I think, a dozen books like this on many different topics, all very, very important to the development of India. And many of these people who are authors in this came and took part in this process. Some did not, but because the topics had come up and were very important. So the topics all came up through a very generic process of consultation. It was not that I decided that I'm a gender expert and these topics are important, but what people wanted to share and talk about, the most burning policy issues of today. And so then most of these people, as I said, were in the process, and some we just roped in later because we felt their voice was very important to be heard as well.
Yes, this is an extensive series. I think 6 books are released as of now, and there are 14 in total. I don't know if you can see the shelf, but I have all the other 5 copies as well.
Yeah.
Yes, and I've read 3, and I'm reading the 4th one. It's a great series to read.
Thank you.
Coming back to the book at hand. So there have been numerous reports about increase in domestic violence during COVID and the lockdown which followed, especially uh, saw a spree of articles in April 2020 on focus of this aspect. And in one of the chapters in the book, relying on National Family Health Survey, it is stated that women who make household decisions jointly with their husbands are less likely to experience spousal violence. And further, that essay goes on to talk about that the protection granted by the Domestic Violence Act has turned out to be detached from the ground. And so, what do you think? What can be the possible reforms in this aspect? Further, what could be the reason behind this? That women who consult their husbands or other family members, specifically even if they're talking about their own earnings, are less likely to experience spousal violence.
So what we say in this whole book, basically, you've captured the essence of it, is really that women lack power. Basically, that is the summary of the book. And that is why the title, it doesn't say from promise to wealth, or it doesn't say from promise to something else. We are saying that women don't have power. And basically by that, we mean two kinds. Either in their own lives, within their own families, they have no say in any kind of important decision that is being made. And nor do they have the power collectively to change society. So we divide the book into three parts. We look at issues within the family. And the first essay we look at is domestic violence, because it's a very, very important topic. And then we look at issues in the workforce, and then we look at issue in politics, ultimately, which is where you have the power to actually change society as a whole, not just your own life and your own family. So that is why we say the sign that they don't make any decision in their family is just a sign of saying, another way of saying that they lack power within their family. You know, there are all these studies that are showing that women are earning through self-help groups and other things, but many other studies that show that despite having some income in their hands, it doesn't automatically translate into more decision making. Women will say, yes, I earn the money, but even when I go to the market, if I have to buy even one small piece of candy or chocolate or something for myself, I can't take that decision, right? And so that is just a way of saying most women living in a family, married women, 1/3 of them are saying that they are subject to domestic violence. It's very high. When you look at these rural women's lives, you know, they're working from, get up early in the morning, they go into cook the food, send their children to school, then they go and work in the field all day, then they come home, they do all the household work, which is on average 6 hours a day, cooking, cleaning, clean the house, and then, you know, just imagine a life like that then they're subject to violence at the end of the day like that. It's really very problematic. And 33% are subject to violence. But what is the other thing the book says is that the reason why women have such little power in their own lives to manage their own lives or to change society is because society there are something called social norms, that these are what collectively we have decided the roles for women, our expectations from men versus women, who should work, who should take care in the house. And these norms just don't change very easily over time. You know, of course, I mean, as law students, you know, I'm sure we'll come to that. What's the role of law versus social norms? But these social norms have found to be very sticky, very slow to change. They change slowly over hundreds of years. And this is found to be the case not just in India, but in all the countries in the world. You know, in a study that I quote in the book done by the World Bank, saying some things are just not changing, and domestic violence is one of them. It's a problem across the world for women. And in this book, again, a very shocking statistic that 52% of women say that it's acceptable, that this is the norm. They just accept that, right? They're not even trying to fight it, or they're not even trying to change it, because it's just become accepted. 42% of men. So more women think for small things, like they went out of the house without permission, or they didn't look after their children, or they argued with their mother-in-law. They think these are good enough reasons for them to be subject to violence. So, of course, a law in this case is a very important way to change a norm. But the problem with the domestic violence law, like with many other very excellent laws that we have in India, is that it remains on paper. You know, you pass a very good law, but then you make absolutely no effort to implement it at all. So in this case, hardly any, there's no national scheme, unlike like the right to education, the law was passed and then a huge budget was put behind it to implement it. There's no scheme at all behind the domestic violence law. And so the center has just left it to each state. And we've talked to many states, as I said, when you in my introduction, you said we worked in the poorest states as Oxfam, UP, Bihar, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Assam, Orissa. There was no implementation of this law. I mean, they say, if the center doesn't give us money, we are such poor states that we have no discretionary funds with which to actually implement the law. So it's just there. It has absolutely no effect. And even laws that have money, I mean, one or two southern states who are rich enough did put a bit of money behind it, but by and large, the law, I would say, 10 years later remains very much on paper. Even where the laws are there, and if you don't need a lot of money, if you're going to change people's ideas about what is acceptable and not acceptable, at the very least, you need to do a very large campaign to make people aware there is such a law. We used to go from house to house, door to door, and ask women, did you know that now domestic violence, there's a law against it. You don't need to accept it. There are remedies available. Nobody knew anything about it. How will they know? Just because you passed a law doesn't mean anything at all. It's like just the very tiny first step. Then you have to do a campaign. Then you have to educate people. Then you have to put a budget behind it. Then you have to train the entire police force, the judiciary, all the machinery that is associated. And none of these things are really happening. So many laws. I mean, this is really like a world-class law, actually, if you just look at it on paper. But hardly any implementation at all.
So you also mentioned about the work hours that women give at home and then they are subject to violence. And the book goes on to talk about the unpaid care work as well. We'll shift to the next aspect of the book, which is that in the chapter talking about the reproductive rights of women and healthcare, says that deep-seated patriarchal norms and misinterpretation of masculinity are the reason behind poor access to reproductive healthcare. If you could just elaborate on a bit.
So this is about, making family planning decisions, basically, reproductive rights, who makes those decisions. And again, because women have very little power, very little voice, they have to bear the burden of family planning in India. Basically, that's what that chapter is saying, that it would be very easy for men to share that burden. Condoms are easily available, but men don't like to use them. And therefore, what you're using really is female sterilization as the predominant method of birth control. Now, you think of that in terms of ease of doing and the implications for your health and all of that, right? I mean, here's one little thing, you put on a condom and you have sex. Here's another thing where you're going to put a woman through sterilization. And if you remember these horrible accounts that we all read of how they do these sterilization camps in Chhattisgarh, right? They give you a very tiny monetary incentive, and so the family then, the poor family just send this poor woman to get this sterilization. And they were doing something like 80 women. They were sterilizing. They sterilized within 6 hours. And the accounts were horrific, right? You were just doing the operation and then just literally throwing them on the ground in a very unsanitary conditions. And 11 women died during that process. But so you imagine the huge burden that you're putting on the health of a woman over something that is very, very tiny and easy to solve if it was a shared responsibility. There are many other easy kinds of birth control methods available for women. Those are not looked into India. So, and then, the chapter also talks about like abortion almost being used as a birth control. So look at the burden you're putting on the woman. The birth control, all is through female sterilization, hardly any male sterilization. And then where you're not doing that, like a lot of very high rates of abortion. So it's every single chapter is building on the same story, that women are being put through these decisions that the family is making rather than what they are making, and they have no say in many of these decisions that affect their lives, their bodies, their choices, and with huge horrific consequences for their health and their well-being, and in many cases then their lives. I mean, in this case, these women died in their primary childbearing years, right?
And I think the Uttar Pradesh government is about to bring a law for population control. It's very much in the news. The draft was introduced by the Law Commission, I guess. And again, we can see that the repercussions it can have specifically on women, because the law says that anyone with more than 2 children would be disqualified for government jobs or would not be allowed to contest for elections. It will just have ripple effects, and against these mass scale sterilization might increase.
It's a very bad idea, actually, that law is just
Yeah.
not needed in India right now. India is
Exactly.
already on a downward path to bringing down total fertility rates. In many of the southern and western states that are more developed, that fertility rate is already at replacement level. And we say development is the best contraceptive. In UP, they need to educate their girls, educate their women, give them some livelihood, and that will automatically bring down this and give better access to contraception. There are huge unmet needs for women. Instead of doing all that, and in UP also it is coming down. It's just that it's a bit slower than in the rest of the country. So it's a very, very bad law. Actually, most countries have stopped doing things like that. China did this one child policy, then they realize now they have a very old country. I mean, you can't, you're just going to have this burden, and India is much, much poorer than China. We will not be able to really afford that. Now they've opened up to a 2-child policy. Now recently they've opened up to a 3-child policy. And we are going backwards, actually.
Yes, and for former Chief Election Commissioner Dr. S.Y. Qureshi, he has written a book, The Population Myth, although that primarily talks about Islam and the myths about family planning, but there's an extensive research in that book about total fertility rate going down, and it's also given state-wise, and I think I would recommend the Law Commission members to actually read it.
Yeah, he wrote an article. I think there was an article in today's paper, I think in the Indian Express.
In the Indian Express, yes.
Yeah, so a summary of his book.
Yes. So I'm moving to the next part of the book. So Swarna Rajgopalan, in her chapter, writes that a legally compliant workplace is not necessarily a gender just, a gender equal workplace. And she goes on to say that education, economic independence, and social status are no protection against the impunity granted to men by patriarchy. This again comes back to the point even in sexual harassment at workplace, it's the same argument that women lack power. Could you elaborate upon this in light of the recent judgment by Goa Session Court and Tarun Tejpal judgment, which it's just a very bad judgment. It completely based on stereotypes and goes to the extent of defining what an ideal sexual assault victim should behave like.
Right. No, so this is yet another example of a law, just like the domestic violence law, which is again there on paper. All these laws are a very important, necessary condition to getting to where we want to go. But by themselves, they're not sufficient. Just by passing the law, you're not changing anything unless you are very, very serious about implementing it. Now, if it is widely accepted in culture, that these kinds of harassments happen, and if you see like the very first case of sexual harassment that we all talk about, this Bhavri Devi one, right? Till now, 25 years later, she has not gotten justice because she was a rural worker, raped by men. She was trying to stop a little girl from getting married, from a child marriage. And basically the court said that why would these upper caste men rape a lower caste woman? We have so many stereotypes in our head of all kinds of different power structures that are in India. In the corporate world, our corporate world has certainly not kept up in terms of being a very gender equal world. If you look at it, the Corporate Affairs Ministry passed that guideline of saying, you start at the very top at the board, that there should be only one woman. Just starting with that to mandate one woman on the board. Many corporates have not even done that till today. And why one woman? One woman alone cannot change a board or change the world. There's plenty of evidence that if you're serious, you need a critical mass of at least 33%. When there are enough people of a certain mindset, they can then take on the rest of the board or the rest of the company or the rest. So, that I think is very urgent that law should be changed to immediately say that 50% of the women on companies should be women, on a board. And this is happening in many countries in the West now, because again, it's not happening organically. Men have the power at the top and they will not give it up voluntarily. So it is usually a law that is needed to change these kinds of norms. You look at then, coming down from the board, the senior leadership team and so on. All these are predominantly men. All the power structures within our companies are all men. And women are in these junior positions and they're fighting to keep a job, they're supporting a family. And if they're getting harassed at work, and unfortunately, as in the Tarun Tejpal case, as you mentioned, these things happen behind closed doors, or the MJ Akbar case, for example, which was just so shocking, that he's suing the woman for defamation of reputation. But in that case, at least there were many girls, young women who came forward, and so there's a sort of thing built around it. But in this case, there's this Tarun Tejpal, a very powerful man, and then this very young girl, and whatever happens is happening behind closed doors. And so it's your word against some powerful man's word. So you never actually win these cases. It's not about winning a sexual harassment case. It's about preventing them from happening in the workplace. And the only way to do it is really changing the corporate culture. And I mean, when I was in the World Bank and many years ago, like 20 years ago, 25 years ago, we started all these trainings and men would just laugh. They just thought this was the funniest thing to say. You can't make rude remarks about somebody's clothes, or you can't tell a joke, or you can't put up certain kinds of pictures on your walls, and that all this was offensive to women, to see yourself being portrayed when you just were trying to come, to do a job, and here you are being portrayed as a sexual object all the time. I mean, but years and years and years of very consistent messaging right from the top, lots of training, lots of sanctions. Then if you had these very, like we have under our law here, committees are set up, you go and complain, you hear both sides, and then if people are found to be really harassing women, they lose their jobs. So you have to follow through with all those aspects. And I don't think here the corporate world is taking it very seriously. I mean, the very fact that we don't hear a lot of, there must be things going on where men and women are working together, and you don't hear. Only in some cases do you hear these very high profile kind of cases like the ones we were mentioning. But in large companies, there must be hundreds of such things going on. So what happens? Do they report him? Do they have good committees? Do they have these outside members? Do cases get to them? You're supposed to report it every quarter to the board. It would be very interesting to look at the annual reports of these corporates and see how many cases are happening and what actions were taken. And was there due process followed? I guess that's the most important thing. But then the rules have to be very, very clear, and every employee must know what they're supposed to do if something happens, right? And so when you walk into a corporate, you should be able to see the very first thing, that here's the phone number you call, or here's the person you contact when there's a case, when something happens to you, when you get harassed. And I'm not sure how many corporates that's happening in right now. So yeah, I mean, these unless the leadership at the very, very top is very serious and then drives it throughout, it's not going to happen. And here, because the leadership is predominantly male, it would be quite an unusual workplace, I would say, which has a very safe environment for women workers. Really, I mean, I would go that far to say that.
So now we'll move to the next section due to paucity of time. So the last part is about political representation. And this is just one line which stuck with me by Tara Krishnaswamy. She writes, when women candidates win, the basic democratic principle of true representation is fulfilled, as the women's population of the electorate gets a voice. She, in her essay, further goes on to talk about this obstructions for women's entry into politics, and she also very beautifully defies the logic that women are not interested in politics, which is something which wherever 5 men are sitting and discussing about women in politics, they'll come up with this argument. Right. And she's explained that very beautifully with data. So could you talk about some of the stereotypical reasons specifically for obstructing women's entry into politics?
Yes. So, yeah. But first, when you say women aren't interested, we have more than 1 million elected women at the panchayat level. And this number is greater than the number of elected women in the rest of the whole world put together. That one number captures everything about, are women interested in politics or not? Of course they are. Why wouldn't they be? right? I mean, we also want to get involved in policy, and we want to shape what's happening around us, and we want more control over our environment and our society and so on. And just, but what did it take to make that happen? It's that quota, right, which brought all those women forward, because they were just waiting for that opportunity. If there was no quota, they would never get that chance to actually do that. So that is the biggest hindrance right now. I would say the very first thing and most urgent thing, and something that would change many of these other things that we're talking about, is that we in India are not used to seeing women in powerful positions. And therefore, we think they can't do it, therefore, because we've never seen them. So, and it also then prevents successive generations of younger women from entering that profession, because that is not who they're aspiring to be. You have the saying, say you can't be what you can't see. That is the most important reason, I would say, one of the most important, to make sure that there are 50% of women in everything that we see, so that it doesn't stop the next generation from saying, I can do that, I can be that, this is where I want to go, and not limited the choices that they're facing. Now, two of the biggest problems when you say what is the hindrance for women, I mean, we talk of money. Two things are needed in money. Money in Indian politics, money or muscle power, right? I mean, there are all these organizations that are doing these studies, and you look at the backgrounds of our politicians, and very large percentages of them are crorepati's, and another very large percentage of them are criminals. And together, the criminals, why? Because they have all this muscle power behind them to make all that politics happen. And so these are the two things that would really be a big hindrance for women. Firstly, money, where is that going to come from? Because the men, they're inheriting it from their families. I mean, property rights, you take that law. The law is again on paper, but not getting implemented at all. And so politicians are then passing on that legacy to their sons. But as soon as you see women politicians who are daughters or wives of other politicians, people immediately say that, oh, they're, family members and so on. But if you look at the number of male politicians, a large percentage of them are also related to other politicians. So getting money to run an election, because it is so expensive in India, and we don't have access to common funds that would support candidates, unlike in many other countries. And secondly, this fact that there is a lot of violence associated in our elections now. UP elections are coming up. It's scary. I mean, we know what happened there last time, right? So these are the two big deterrents. But despite this, if there was a quota for women in parliament, in the state assemblies, you would see large numbers of women coming up. They prove themselves time and again at the local level. There should be a pipeline, as all the three politicians say, from that local level into the state assembly, into higher levels, into state assemblies, and then into national politics. And unfortunately, these pipelines are not there. And because of our party system, it's very hard, unless a party puts you on that list, for women to enter politics independently. I mean, independent candidates, it's very, very hard under our party system. So there is this block. This women's reservation bill was first introduced in Parliament 25 years ago. And it is just not there. Every party puts it in their manifesto. Every party wins, and then they forget it the next day, and they have absolutely no intention of passing it, because the men in those parties are just not going to give up their seats, And so it's not going to happen from the top. It's going to take what the farmers are doing. I mean, look at what the farmers are doing to fight for their rights. They're sitting out there for now, 6 or 8 months now, in that heat, in the rain, in the winter, everything. And this is really the only thing that when women come together and decide that, we want a fair share of our representation. I mean, this government now just put 11 out of 77 women in their cabinet, and they were saying Nari Shakti. We're not 11% of this population, we're 50% of the population. Unless you give us 50% of the seats, you can't say Nari Shakti. I mean, that doesn't make any sense, right? So, but we will have to fight for it. We will have to unite across caste, religion, region, all the other things that divide us, and come together and say we need to have 50% of our voice, because it's really, I don't think any political party is very serious about that.
So, despite these challenges and across areas, and I myself got to know that how ignorant I am on certain aspects after reading the book, and I thank you very much for it. Now, despite all these problems, your introduction, which you wrote the conclusion to it, you have concluded by the line, "This is our hope for the future, that we'll not have to wait for another 70 years, but that disruptive change will shatter patriarchal norms and bring progress much faster than the trajectory seen in the last 70 years." What drives this hope?
What drives this hope is that I was finalizing it when I was seeing Shaheen Bagh.
Okay.
You know, it's the fact that Indian citizens are now beginning to come together and demand their rights and challenge laws and the current situation that is not conducive to them. So I just mentioned the farmers' movement, but you see the Shaheen Bagh, and I went there several times to see what was happening. And here was this woman, Bilkis Banu, this 82-year-old Dadi, who is there, just sitting there saying, "This is not the kind of India I want that divides us. I want something more inclusive, and I'm going to fight for it." And behind her, then, there were these kinds of movements all over India, young people, old people, boys, girls, men, farmers, everybody supporting her. Somebody who had never really led movements or done anything like that, but she was so fearless, and she was named this Times 100 most influential women in the world, and BBC also said 100 most influential women in the world. If somebody like her, just an ordinary citizen, would be so brave, and now you're beginning to see all these young girls coming out, incredibly brave. I mean, they've gone to prison now and really, getting forged to take on battles. I feel if these people can come together, the young, the old, whoever is interested in a more equal and inclusive India, and there are many people like that. I mean, that I have faith in, that we're going through this time, which is very divisive, but this is not who we are. And eventually enough people will come out to say that, and that therefore we will see something that is really gives us our fair share of power,
So I'm just, we have a few minutes left. A quick note on, so I wrote a review for this book also in Feminism in India. I pointed out one aspect which I felt I had a reservation on this, which was that there was no talk about judiciary, because judiciary, we have been saying it is affecting Indian citizens' life on a very ground level. And so we have very less number of women judges. There's just one in Supreme Court right now. There were 3 a year ago. So why this aspect was left out?
Not deliberately, I think. Maybe, we didn't. There are many areas that are very unequal. If you look at anything, if you look at the police, if you look at, the judiciary. So as a symbol of political power, because I don't think, we could pass a women's reservation bill and we could get a quota to say in parliament there should be. I have not heard of that happening for the judiciary in any country in the world. I don't think that's how it works. So I'm not actually sure what would make the judicial system more equal and how. It would have to come from the judges themselves, really. It's not like a policy tool. But yes, the judiciary has to be more equal, the police has to be more equal, the academics have to be more equal, anything that is influencing. Anybody who influences anything has to be,
Yeah, especially, I would like to quote Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg here, who says, when asked about when will there be enough judges in the Supreme Court, and she said when there will be 9, which is the strength of the Supreme Court. So, thank you so much, ma'am, for taking your time out for us and talking to us about this wonderful book. I would strongly recommend whoever is watching, please read the book. I've said this earlier. If there's one book you're going to read this year, make sure this is the one. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you so much. Thank you.